Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 7th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. For I am also a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. There has been, and there is going to be a whole lot more political discourse. Well, discourse is really the wrong word. We in our culture, our politicians don't discourse anymore. I don't think. We just yell at each other and insult each other and take tweet-sized pot shots at stereotyped caricatures of the so-called views of each other, and then we let that pass for discourse. But whatever it is, there's been a lot of it, and there's going to be way more of it, centered on the topic of walls that we in this country either do or don't need to build in order to keep people who are different from us, other than us, away from us, whether they are other than us because of the language they speak or other than us because of the name they use for the God they either do or don't speak to. And I don't know all the answers to all the complicated questions there surely are when it comes to immigration policies in times like these. We'll have to work that out with the best leaders we in this land of the free choose to freely elect. But I do want to point out, and I don't regard this as a political statement. I really don't do politics in the pulpit, but it's a biblical statement, and I do Bible in the pulpit. I want to point out that in reading this week's assigned text, the first thing that I just couldn't not notice is that all three of them are way more interested not in walls, but rather in bridges that are built between people, including, and by including, I mean including specifically, people who don't speak the same language and people who don't worship and understand God in the same way. They are specifically mentioned in these passages. And so, in our first text today, there's King Solomon, who's remembered as one of the greatest kings Israel ever had, but who also, like his father, King David, remembered as the greatest king Israel ever had, was nevertheless very human. I mean, the Bible is very clear about telling us stories to show us that David and Solomon were both flawed and made some mistakes. Or as we used to say, they were both sinners and they did some sinning. But nevertheless, both of them were also great leaders whose great desire was for God to be the leader of them. And Solomon, in a desire to demonstrate that, in our text has just finished building the first ever temple for the Lord God of Israel. And in today's text, that temple is being dedicated. And Solomon himself prays the dedicatory prayer. The head of state is praying the dedicatory prayer. And including in that prayer are some prayers specifically about foreigners. Foreigners. We these days either don't use that word because we deem it politically incorrect, or we do use it, but only when we're talking about walls. Solomon dedicating the walls of the temple, prayed not that foreigners would be kept from here, but his prayer was that foreigners, because this building and its walls stand here, foreigners, seeing it, will be drawn to the ways of the God who is worshipped here. Which is really kind of a timely prayer for Gloria Dei folks to maybe start praying, as these days we are busy working on our building for God. It's important. This is why we've been having these small group gatherings, these grace gatherings. It's important for us to be thinking and praying these days, a few months from the day when the work will be done, and we'll be in this building and we'll be rededicating it to the purposes and desires of God. It's important for us to be reminded of the desire of the God we worship here to be known and worshiped not just by us's who are here, but also by the not-us's who aren't here, some of whom think of things like God and Christianity as foreign to them, and thousands and thousands of whom every year walk by and drive by and see this church's walls on the corner of Dubuque and Market. It's important to be reminded, because Solomon's prayer reminds us of this, that the walls of the house of worship we build do not exist to turn people from God, but rather to draw all people, insiders and outsiders, to God and to God's love for them and to God's loving desires for them. Speaking of being loved, even though you're not one of us, you're not an insider, you're an outsider. In the gospel text for today, the Jewish leaders in the small village of Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee approached Jesus on behalf of an outsider, a Roman centurion in their midst, and they asked Jesus to heal the man's slave. This is really a wall-demolishing move. First of all, because the Jewish leaders in the Gospels oftentimes are the ones who wanted nothing to do with Jesus, and also because the Roman army, which occupied the lands of Israel, was despised in Israel because they were the enemy. These Jewish leaders in this story, on the other hand, approached Jesus, and they did so on behalf of an enemy. They didn't apparently see this Roman centurion as one of those people that we don't like those people. They didn't see him with categorical foreignness or stereotypical otherness for being one of those people we hate. Apparently they saw him as an actual person. He's a good man, they said. He's been good to us, they said. He's worthy of you going to help him, they said. Although a messenger from the man then soon arrived and said the exact opposite of that the man himself didn't think he was at all worthy of having someone like Jesus come to his house. But a great man like you, he said, you don't even need to come to help. You just say the healing word from afar, and it'll be done. And Jesus did help him, and the servant from afar was healed. Jesus cared for the foreigner. Jesus cared for the foreigner's foreign slave. And he even commended the depth of this foreigner's faith in him, even though, and let's be clear about this foreigner's faith was not the faith of him. For this foreigner was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but the Jew whom Christians call the Christ, the Messiah, loved him and helped him and commended the depth of that man's faith in him, even though it wasn't the same as the faith of him. Those who these days stereotypically and categorically lump together and demonize people whose faith is different from theirs would do well to read this story, perhaps several times, and to reflect on it, perhaps for a long time. Speaking of reaching out to those who aren't us in the name of He whom we call the Lord of us and Lord of all, our second lesson, starting today, and this is going to go on for 6 weeks, our second lesson is from Paul's letter to the Galatians, which, by the way, is short enough. It's so short that you could actually just read it. You can, like, to get ready for the next 6 weeks, you could just actually do that this afternoon, for example. Which wouldn't make God love you any more than God already loves you. Which, if you read Galatians, you would discover is one of the main big picture points of the book of Galatians, that we can't do anything to make God love us any more than God already does, for our relationship with God isn't based on our doing. It's a grace thing. It's a gift thing, which we receive not by doing, but by faith in the doing that Jesus did for us. Paul, and you will discover this afternoon when you're reading Galatians, Paul wrote Galatians seriously ticked off. And in the couple of places, I mean, he's Paul and all, he's St. Paul and all, and they named cities after him, but in a couple of places, he may have even expressed his anger inappropriately. Paul, like David and Solomon, is a great man of the faith, but he's not a perfect man even after he comes to faith, because there's 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 verses in Galatians that he possibly should have counted to 10 before finishing. But that said, though he may have gone a tiny bit far in expressing how angry he was, there's a pretty good reason that he was as angry as he was. Paul, you see, as a young man, had devoutly been this religious Jew who followed to the letter every Jewish law there was, and he had come to understand that his religious purpose in life was to rid the world violently, if needed, of those absolutely wrong in their faith Christians who were saying that Jesus, who had been killed in part because of his laxness when he hung around with people who broke laws, had been raised from the dead and was in fact the Messiah that the Jews had been promised. Was on his way to round up some of these Christians and put them behind some prison walls, Paul was encountered by the risen and glorified Christ. And though at first blinded by the light, he also immediately saw the light, and he knew that he had been 180 degrees wrong about Jesus. But when Jesus, rather than taking him out for his wrongness, said instead, I want you on my team. I want you to reach to the whole world in my name. Paul totally knew that it so totally wasn't one bit of religious rule keeping which earned or healed the 180 degree in the wrong direction brokenness of his relationship with God. It was grace. Paul, called by the risen Christ, then spent the rest of his life, and in the end he gave his life, reaching out to give as much of the non-Jewish rule-keeping world as he could the good news, the gospel message, that they, like him and like all people, could know the healed and forgiven fullness of a relationship with the living Christ, not by any good or religious doing that they did, but by grace through faith in the doing that Jesus did for them. And one of the places that Paul went to gather by grace a group of people and to start a Christian church was in Galatia, which is an area in the highlands of what is now central modern Turkey. And then he left Galatia to share the gospel and start a church, gather a group by grace elsewhere. And then he got the news from Galatia, that after he left, some other preachers, these were not Lutherans, some other preachers had followed him in. And these preachers, like Paul and every one of the first disciples, were Jews who had come to believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and they believed that the gospel of Jesus was to be shared with the whole world, Gentiles and everything. But, they said, a friend of mine calls this the ashtray gospel. Starts like it sounds like grace and good news, but then it gets filled in with all these buts. Of course, Jesus died and rose for the Gentiles, not just for the Jews, they said. But, they said, that business about you don't have to keep the Jewish laws, that business about there's nothing you have to do because it's all grace. Listen, Galatians, Paul, for starters, who was he? I heard he used to persecute Christians. Paul was wrong. Sure, Jesus died and rose for your sins. Believe it and be saved. But he was the Messiah promised to the Jews. And if you want truly to be saved, there are laws of the Jews that you need to obey, starting with the law that all males must be circumcised. It's what we do. It's what we've always done. And Paul, when he got word, without counting to 10, wrote the book of Galatians, including those verses we heard this morning. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ, and you are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you, and they want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we have proclaimed to you, let that one be accursed. Hashtag the Greek word anathema. Hashtag cut off from Christ and the church. Hashtag damned. Paul, right from the beginning, is obviously ticked off as he writes the book of Galatians. Why? Because the truth of the entire gospel is at stake here. For he had gone to Galatia preaching the unconditional love of God, the grace alone love of God for the Gentile foreigners he met there, only now to have these other preachers follow him in and say, oh, no. Yes, of course, Jesus is the Messiah for you Gentiles too, but there are rules. There are traditions that we have. There are things we do, things we've always done, things you now have to start doing to really, really completely be one of us saved by grace people. You know, for the very earliest Christians, the very earliest of whom had all been Jews, it's hard for us to imagine what a big deal this was, especially when it came to these hallmark rituals and rites and rules like circumcision, which for centuries had defined the Jews. We're going to hear that play out in the book of Galatians for 6 weeks. Later in the summer, Thursday group, when we start going to the book of Acts, we are going to see this issue play out in dramatic fashion. But though the question of circumcising anyone anymore isn't an active spiritual question, I think there's a twin question that is very live. As we sit here on the corner of Dubuque and Market, and every year thousands of foreigners, or people who think that Christian faith is a foreign thing, walk by or drive by, and we think of reaching beyond our walls with the free gift of God's grace and love for them. Here's the question. This is not rhetorical. As we reach, as we invite, as we love, as we seek to build bridges, not walls, how much does someone outside our walls need to become just like us in order to come to faith in Christ with us? How much does someone outside of our walls need to fit in with the way we've always done things within these walls and how we do things elsewhere too, in order truly and completely to be truly welcome here and to do things with us? And if the answer is, well, grace, if the answer is that all are welcome, and if we really mean that, how will anyone know that? By looking at our walls? Question. Can you think of anybody that with your words you could tell that to, or that with your deeds you could show that to? I know, no, you don't wear your faith on your sleeve. I know that's not your deal. Final question. All are welcome. Do you think God can think of anybody that you could tell that to? Or show that to? Amen.